I don't have a sponsor, so if you want to support my work and help it to continue, you can subscribe to my Patreon. I'm making new animation projects week by week and providing animation assets that can be downloaded and used. I also have a very large collection of tutorials in the LinkedIn Learning Library covering animation and design, and I'm putting all the links to these in the notes below.
Continuing on some of my recollections of working for the Don Bluth studio in the late 1980s to the early 90s, I'd like to give you just a description of the place, show you some photographs for those that might be interested in the past, because it's gone forever. Basically, we're probably never going to see these kind of studios again. I have some photographs, some of which I took from a Facebook group of people that used to work for the Don Bluth studio, so I hope they're okay to use. They're public. I don't think anyone has a problem, but just in case, I'm just going to put that out there. Initially, there was a separate early studio that they worked in, but then they migrated to the Cunningham Road studio near the Phoenix Park. So it's kind of to the west of the city centre of Dublin. 6 floors. 4 of those floors were visible from the ground. So you'd walk in from the street onto what was the 3rd floor, and then the other 2 were below because it was kind of on a slope. The 3rd floor that you walked onto, you had the lobby area right in front of you, and then to the right of that, there was the effects department. They did all the effects animation, water, smoke, classic Don Bluth, magic sparkles, that kind of stuff. The 4th floor was kind of the Roman galley. That was where all the in-betweens were done. When I arrived there first, it was a mixed bag. It was chaos, and it was great because you'd have animators sitting next to the in-betweeners all mixed in. It wasn't probably a very efficient way of doing business, but it was fun, and I got there just for a few months. Then we came in one day and they had rearranged the whole floor into basically 4 rows on each side, and it was just the in-betweeners and the cleanup artists, and they moved all the animators and assistants to the 5th and 6th floors. So that sucked. Anyhow, the 5th floor was where Don and Gary had their offices, and you would go up onto the whatever side you went in on. If you went in on the eastern side, then you would have the layout department, lots of drawn backgrounds. You had I think the painting was down there too. Then you had Don and Gary in the middle with some video machines for reviewing animation. Your heart would already be going like a mile a minute when you're showing your work or what you were doing, try to get it approved. They had some audio stuff done there too. Don had a cat that was very angry always. Remember the angry cat? They had Steenbeck studios there too, where they had the old film reels where they would do a lot of editing, and you'd always hear audio looping coming out of those places. A couple of the directing animators had offices there on the Ralph and Dick Zondag. They had animation offices there too on that floor. Up onto the 6th floor, in the middle of that, you had the always mysterious Mr. Sullivan, because this was the Sullivan Bluth animation studio. Wouldn't have existed without him. He was an Irish American, Morris Sullivan, and he kind of became involved in the Bluth project. He was very impressed by him. And being Irish American, he, I guess, wanted to do something for the old country. So thanks, Morris. Never heard a peep out of him. He was this sort of silent partner. Even today, I couldn't tell you one thing about the guy. He had a nice office. You'd see him sometimes. That was it. And then the rest of the 5th floor, we had the only air-conditioned room in the building, which was the screening room. For early periods in the studio's history, we were able to get reels from movie studios, the latest movie releases, and we could watch them every Thursday night. There'd be The Hunt for Red October was one, and Spike Lee Do the Right Thing was another. And then one of the unions didn't like the fact we were a non-union shop, so they shut it down. But also all the other animators were up there too, and a lot of assistants, so they had their offices up there on the top floor, the 6th floor. On the 2nd floor, you had cell painting, inking, Xerox process where they would peg up the Xerox cells, paint mixing for mixing up the paint for the cells, which is obviously not done anymore. It's all digital. And we had the 2nd floor cafeteria. How could I forget? There was a cafeteria on the 2nd floor. There was a cafeteria on the 4th floor. I may or may not have pictures for these. I'll do my best. The 2nd floor cafeteria was kind of dark because the only windows were on the Liffey side. If you look at the Liffey side of the building, you could see the River Liffey going across, and beyond that, Houston Station. So we'd spend a lot of time when you didn't feel like working, staring at the window, watching the guys in their railway yards working their asses off while we had coffee and apple danishes or what have you. The bottom floor was the camera department, where they had these huge, what did they call them? Can't remember, Cinetron or Cinetech, but they were these very complex computer controlled cameras that were able to do really complex camera moves, and you had to have like extremely high skills to work with those. That was about it for the bottom floor. A separate building across the way, there was human resources, which you didn't want to mess with. On the 3rd floor also, the entry floor in the middle of it was our computer department, and they did some really great work, but they also did stuff like the opening for Rockadoodle, which is really asking the technology to do too much. But oftentimes the computer department would do things like the car in All Dogs Go to Heaven. You couldn't really hand animate such a complex geometry. In the classic Disney era, they would use models and then trace over them to try to get these kind of geometries locked down. By the time Bluth was doing it, that would all be done as a wireframe, exported from the computer wireframe onto a cell and painted by hand. So it's a really cool look, and definitely distinctive. But again, today that would all be digital. There wouldn't be this printing out to the cell. So that's the basic layout of the studio. I don't think I'm forgetting too much. All things thinking about it and looking back, a nice enough spot. Short walk down past the Phoenix Park, and there was the infamous Deer Park pub where a lot of people would hang out. I didn't drink at the time, so I wasn't in there too often, but that's another establishment that's long gone. Yeah, so I'd say the studio would have on average at any one time maybe about 300 people in it, something like that. And we're fairly packed in, but there was definitely a lot of churn. Like people would come and go. So over the course of the studio, I'd say a good number of people, couple of thousand probably went through it. A lot of people would come in, work for a while, move on to London or Berlin or Germany or what have you. Anyway, that's the physical layer of the studio, so I'll talk more in more movies about some of the shenanigans that went on, good, bad and ugly, because there's a lot of things I like about that time, a lot of things that weren't so much fun. Don't know which I'll put on YouTube or not, because some things I just don't want to talk about openly on a YouTube channel. I'll put some stuff behind the Patreon. It's not libelous or anything, it's just I don't want to stick it on YouTube, but I'll put the funner stuff on YouTube and then some of the behind the scenes stuff on my Patreon. So hopefully we'll talk about this again soon.
I don't have a sponsor, so if you want to support my work and help it to continue, you can subscribe to my Patreon. I'm making new animation projects week by week and providing animation assets that can be downloaded and used. I also have a very large collection of tutorials in the LinkedIn Learning Library covering animation and design, and I'm putting all the links to these in the notes below.